Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to week 7 in our 9-week series on burnout. And we're finally getting to the point where we're going to start talking about recovery. And in the last 6 weeks, we explored what burnout is, how it changes the way your brain functions. We've looked at attention, emotions, sleep, relationships, decision making. So today we begin that next chapter, which is the road to recovery. And one of the biggest misconceptions actually about burnout is that recovery happens by just taking a break, and it happens as soon as you stop. Now, the evidence from the literature suggests something slightly different in that it's a biological process that occurs over time. So today we're going to explore a little bit about what's happening inside your brain when that's happening during the early stages of recovery. And as you can imagine, there's a lot to cover. So what I've done is I've divided it out into the last 3 seminars. I've deliberately divided it out because the science, gives us a lot more than we can get across in 20 minutes. So today we'll focus on what begins to happen inside your brain when recovery starts. Next week, then, we'll begin. And sorry, I should also say that we'll begin to look at the process of what helps that recovery to begin. But as always, I'm a firm believer in understanding the mechanisms by which things happen, and that makes action a bit more easy. Next week, we'll get further into that, what actually helps to engender recovery, and more importantly, why they work from a neuroscience perspective. And finally, then we'll finish off the series by looking at how we reduce the risk of burnout reappearing. So think of these in many ways as 3 chapters of the same story. So I often like to start with the have you ever noticed? So you can imagine this kind of experiential piece. So this is something that people who've experienced burnout have described to me is you finally finish some job or some demanding project or whatnot. You take annual leave or you reduce your workload somehow. And you kind of expect to wake up feeling refreshed straight away. But instead you feel exhausted and concentration is poor and thinking is slow, and that remains. And then with that comes this kind of worry that something more serious is actually wrong. And one of the most reassuring things that we can say to people in that context, again taken from the literature, is that this is often a part of an entirely normal part of what we understand about burnout. Recovery often begins before it feels like recovery, if that makes sense. And this is often the case actually with mental health in general, is that we have to take steps, as it were, in the dark, where you feel like it's not making any difference. But that by itself is the beginning of recovery. And that's going to be a recurring theme. You'll see this appearing again in a few moments. It's not a switch. Recovery isn't a switch. And I like to use the analogy of exercise. And we are well used to this phenomenon. If you're running for an hour and you stop, you don't expect recovery in that moment. Your breathing doesn't return to normal immediately. Neither does your heart rate. Your body needs time to readjust to what has just happened, to return back to a baseline. And our brain seems to do remarkably, engage in a remarkably similar process. That is, it during recovery or during burnout, the stress response systems have become activated repeatedly over long periods. And when your pressure begins to reduce, the brain doesn't instantly return to its previous state. Recovery is a gradual biological process because biological processes are gradual in general. And what's happening is, in many ways, mirroring the mechanisms by which burnout became an issue in the first instance. That is, you didn't wake up one morning and say, well, I'm burnt out today and I wasn't burnt out yesterday. It's a slow, gradual, insidious process to get there. And it is a slow, gradual process to get away from it. Recovery then simply isn't about just feeling better. Your brain itself has to reorganize itself. During burnout, resources become increasingly directed towards managing this chronic stress. You remember we talked about that phenomenon whereby the demands that are being placed on you are greater than the resources that you have at your disposal. And this happens over time, repeatedly. As recovery progresses, the resources that you have gradually become available again, gradually for attention, gradually for memory, gradually for planning and emotional regulation, etc. And it isn't something you can consciously force, like recovery from anything, to be fair. It is something your brain gradually begins to do when the conditions allow. So this then becomes a part of our focus is how can I create the conditions repeatedly, consistently, sustainably to allow the recovery process, which is gradual, to begin. And not only is it gradual, but people expect a steady, linear improvement over time. In many ways, like we do with physical health. If you've had a total hip replacement or a broken bone, we tend to think of recovery as this linear event. But when it comes to mental health, research tells us and clinical experience tells us that recovery simply isn't linear. It's rarely linear. You might have several good days, several bad days, a good day, a bad day. That doesn't mean the recovery has stopped. It's this up and down is characteristic of mental health and life in general because the demands change and your environment changes and the requirements around you change and your own physiology changes. So a bad day in recovery doesn't mean you have lost or you're back to the beginning. Recovery then, a lot, and I've used this analogy before, it's a bit like hair growing. It's not judged over individual days because you'll see very little difference from today compared to yesterday. It's rather better judged over weeks and months. So again, a process begins whereby we create the conditions for recovery. And recovery is beginning even before you feel it. And then when you do feel it, we know that it's not linear and not consistent. But what we're looking for is the line of best fit, as it were, to be moving in the right direction over weeks and months. The difficult days are part of the process rather than evidence that you've gone backwards. And of course, that's difficult because we want it to be linear and predictable, and we want it to be quick, and we want it to be over with. But as we know, our brains don't work that way. To add to the complexity, different parts of your brain recover at different rates. And of course, this adds to that confusing sense of the nonlinearity of recovery. Different brain areas don't recover in line with each other or simultaneously. Some people describe sleeping better. And then later on, they describe changes or improvements in their concentration. Other people notice they're emotionally calmer, but they're still mentally fatigued. Or some regain energy before they regain confidence in decision making, for instance. The important point is that recovery doesn't happen uniformly across every brain function. Different systems appear to recover at different rates. So, what helps in the early stages? I'm deliberately not talking about sleep or exercise or nutrition in detail. We'll cover those next week. Instead, I want to focus on mindset or conditions. Recovery is something your brain does, and our role is to create the conditions that allow recovery to continue. Now, research suggests that it helps to be patient with yourself, and that's often a difficult one. I remember one of the weeks before, I said we are very good at compassion, compassion coming from the Latin to suffer with. We are not so good when it comes to self-compassion. So we're very good with other people. Self-compassion is difficult. So part of what we are asked to do is to be patient with ourselves. Expect recovery to fluctuate and don't judge yourself on a single difficult day. It is nonlinear. We all have bad days. But don't judge yourself on that single day. Be patient with yourself. Instead, look for gradual changes over time. So if you remember only one thing from today, can I ask that it is this: recovery is not a switch, it is a gradual biological process for which you need to wait and to have patience. And the key thing, really, beneath all of that is your brain often begins the recovery process before recovery feels real to you. And this just speaks to the way our brain is organized. The bit that we're aware of is only a small part of our brain compared to the rest of it. So your brain is recovering, but sometimes it can feel like it's not. And that's where the patience comes in. So that's the key takeaway. It isn't a switch, it's a gradual biological process that takes patience and is not linear. So if you have been burnt out or you are burnt out, the recovery starts by setting the conditions up whereby we can get our resources to match the demands that are placed upon us. So that's it for this week. Hugely appreciative of your company and joining us on our weekly seminar series. Next week, we're going to really dive into the detail on rebuilding the brain, how sleep, movement, relationships, and daily habits help the brain to recover. And again, as always, we're going to focus on the evidence and not only on what helps, but why those things help a recovering brain. Because again, at the risk of beating the same drum over and over again, I'm absolutely convinced that when people understand the mechanisms, the behaviors in the absence of reinforcement are much easier. So creating the conditions, it's much easier to do that when you don't feel the recovery happening once you understand the process. I hope you'll join me again next week. Looking forward to catching up with everybody then. Thank you very much. I'll see you next week.